We got some somewhat good news about the upcoming MacBook Pros, where Apple is taking a direction I was not really anticipating, but I knew was a possibility. There's certainly some pros and cons to it overall, but I think it's mostly things to be excited for. Let's begin. I know probably most of us are super pumped about the upcoming 14-inch and 16-inch MacBook Pros, and thanks to some leaks from Dylan, and just Dylan, you know, he got some leaks correct earlier about the M1 coming to the iPad Pros, as well as M1 coming to the 24-inch iMac, so at least when it comes to Apple Silicon, he seems to be pretty reliable. He is now telling us that the performance of the M1X chip in the 14-inch MacBook Pro and 16-inch MacBook Pro should be the same, which actually goes against what I've been predicting for a while. I was anticipating that just because Apple loves, you know, money, and they wanted us to buy a bigger MacBook Pro, and in the past, Apple seems comfortable giving the 16-inch MacBook Pro better graphics options and the 14-inch MacBook Pro, you know, no dedicated GPU. I thought Apple was gonna give like 32 GPU cores to the 16-inch model and then 16 GPU cores to the 14-inch model. From Bloomberg's reports in the past, we had heard that the M1X chip would have several different versions of the GPU. It wouldn't just be a one-size-fits-all because these are higher-tier MacBooks, and Dylan is saying Apple is actually going to make performance equivalent, which I think is great, especially for people out there that are not a big fan of the 16-inch model. Not to say that what I predicted is necessarily what I wanted, but because Apple is making their GPUs more integrated, and of course these chips are far more power efficient, it should now mean that similar to the iPad line or the iPhone line, size doesn't really correlate to performance. You know, you can get the M1 chip on the 11-inch iPad Pro or the 12.9-inch iPad Pro, and it's kind of exciting to me to know that that might be the same situation with MacBook Pros moving forward. Whether you want a big one or a small one, you're going to be getting the same game-changing performance. So what differences should you expect other than size? I would say a reasonable one is battery life, just because the current battery in the 16-inch MacBook Pro is like barely legal. So yeah, you can technically take it on flights, but it's really bumping up on the limit of what that is. So I would assume that the larger MacBook Pro would also come with a bit better battery life. But aside from that, same keyboard, same speaker system. I guess it's possible the 16-inch MacBook Pro could have some beefed up speakers, but both of them rocking mini LED, both of them rocking equivalent M1X chips with options likely for higher end GPUs, hopefully RAM options that go past 32 gigs, because with the transition to the M1, Apple seems more comfortable not having higher RAM options, but I'm also hoping for more than 2 terabytes of storage on the M1X, because everything with the M1 caps out at 16 gigs of RAM and 2 terabytes of SSD, so you can't get much more than that, and some of us would like more than that. Also expect to have the same webcams on both these options, so what I'm hoping this results in is lots more people feeling comfortable getting a 14-inch MacBook Pro, because now they know they don't have to opt for that big one to get all that crazy performance. Although I could certainly see some people getting a tad upset by this, because they may think that, well, with a bigger MacBook, you know, that costs more and there's physically more space on the inside for computer components, why not give the 16-inch MacBook Pro a little bit extra? Why not give it some kind of dedicated GPU that could perform better? And if it is true that the upcoming iMac refresh that we may not see until the spring, if that's rocking an M1X chip, then we're talking about having these really expensive big all-in-one computers, and they're going to have the same chip as a basic 14-inch MacBook Pro. And maybe fundamentally people take issue with that, but I would encourage to look at it from a different perspective. Instead of trying to imagine, you know, a giant desktop being powered by a pretty small, light notebook, instead think of it as this giant, powerful, all-in-one desktop that we might get later. Also, we're able to fit that insane performance and all of those great graphics into a very small, compact laptop. There doesn't have to be a big difference between desktop performance and laptop performance anymore, because we're in the age of the ARM architecture. Now it just comes down to how much computational power can we fit on a single chip, and then it's just a matter of what's its power consumption. So yeah, we can throw this chip in a really great iMac. Also, rumors of the M1X Mac Mini happening from Gurman, which I'm super excited for. And now knowing that there won't be any compromises in performance if there's people out there that want to opt for a smaller MacBook, I think overall is a great thing. And it may catch some people the wrong way, but overall, I do think it's a win. The only downside we got from Dylan's leak is mentioning that this 14-inch MacBook Pro is likely not going to start at the same price as the MacBook Pro that it was replacing. So he said that it would cost about the same price as the higher-end 4-port MacBook Pro, the 13-inch model, and Mac Rumors is speculating that that means we should expect the 14-inch MacBook to start around $1,800, which is pretty much what I was anticipating as well, but this also points to the idea that Apple plans on keeping the M1 MacBook Pro, which I definitely think is going to be weird, because that means that in the next couple months, there's a possibility that we're going to have 13-inch MacBook Pros, 14-inch MacBook Pros, and 16-inch MacBook Pros. Little too complicated for my liking. I think that if you want to spend less than $1,800 on a MacBook, Apple should just tell you to get a MacBook Air at this point. They just be like, you know what, M1 chip is good enough for you. I know people like to pretend that the fan makes a big difference, but in most of the comparisons I've seen, even in prolonged, high performance usage, I don't see a massive difference. So I'm okay with MacBook Air just being the entry-level Mac, and if you need more than the M1 chip, then yeah, you gotta spend a tad extra, but you're getting way better battery life, way better graphics, better ports, better dynamic range on that display, probably a much better webcam. I'm okay with that gap, but I'm guessing Apple isn't. They want, a little MacBook Pro in between the Air and the higher end Pros. I just hate the complexity of this lineup, so I suppose if any of you were hoping to grab an M1X MacBook Pro for $1,500, you might be out of luck entirely, but if your main goal is to just find an M1X chip in the cheapest possible way, I would highly encourage you to wait for the M1X Mac Mini, which is supposed to be replacing the Intel Mac Mini by the end of this year, and that model will probably start around $1,100, so once you supply your own monitor and keyboard, you're talking about a pretty dang powerful desktop setup there. But I'm curious what you guys think of performance being equal around more and more of Apple's Macs. Are we getting M1X on the larger size iMac later? Does that mean that there's basically two chips that Apple Silicon is powering the rest of the Mac lineup with? And does that mean we're getting a third tier above the M1X just for the Mac Pro and nothing else? Or do you think that maybe that higher end Mac Pro chip should find its way into an iMac Pro of sorts that doesn't have a channel wide bezels? All that good stuff. Let me know what you're thinking down below. This is your Apple Sheep here. I'll see you guys in the next one.